Let's talk about sex. When should we start the conversation? Hello to you, yes, you. Welcome to Rated PG, Parental Guidance. This is TRINICY, Conservative Christians on and off campus. We're Bible believing Christians. My name is Monica Evans, and the comments and ideas that we'll be sharing today are my own or the ones of my guests. Today we're going to have a special guest. So thank you for connecting with us today. 2 weeks ago, the question was, who should educate our children? And you can find that conversation in the IGTV. The mission of us parents when considering educating our children is to raise our children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So that is Ephesians 6:4. So keep in mind that what we're trying to do is share the parental journey from the Christian perspective. And today we're going to be talking about sex education. Sometimes as parents get embarrassed about this topic. We don't sometimes know when to start a conversation, how is that we should talk about this subject, etc. If you have questions about this specific subject, feel free to send them to the comment section. I'll be checking them throughout today's live session. And if you're checking this out afterwards, once again, feel free to send those questions and we'll keep an eye on them. And you can also use the question box. And today, as I mentioned earlier, we have a special guest. Her name is Kate Wahnsiedlier. And Kate is a junior and she is the student ambassador for TRINICY. So let me go ahead and connect her with us today. Oh, here you are, Kate. Let me add to today's conversation. Let's see. Hi, Kate. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you so much for making the time to connect with us. I am actually super elated to have you because I like actually to listen to what our youth have to say about the different topics, you know. So this is your opportunity to share your perspective. And once again, I'm looking forward to hear, and then we can go over some questions, and then the viewers can go ahead and actually submit their questions, and I'll go ahead and be sure to read them to you.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So I think I'm going to begin with kind of my experience with this topic, which is, so the first time I really learned about sex was probably in the 5th grade, and it was more of an independent thing because I read To Kill a Mockingbird. And so that book discusses rape. And so I didn't really know what that was then at that time when I was in 5th grade. So as a curious 5th grader, I went home and I asked my parents about it, you know, and that's when they kind of took the time to explain this to me because, while I feel like a lot of parents don't quite explain it at 5th grade level, I was kind of ahead in that sense of reading so much that I was starting to find things that needed to be explained so that I wouldn't be incredibly confused and just not know what was going on. Like, for example, then I later ended up reading Gone with the Wind, and that also has a lot of sexual themes in it. And from my perspective, reading that and not knowing what it was really difficult for me because I'm the kind of person who just likes to know about everything. Mm-hmm. So for certain people, I definitely feel that sometimes at a younger age, you start to get more involved with these more mature ideas just because of your mind and just your curiosity levels. And then, of course, there's also the perspective of some kids who have, unfortunately, more exposure to sexual themes at a younger age without having a choice in having that experience just because of their home life. Like, I remember in 6th grade, there was a girl in 8th grade who was pregnant. And for me, that was really shocking. I had never seen something like that before. But a lot of my friends were very confused still. I kind of had a talking to about, what sex is and how it works. And a lot of my friends had no clue what was going on or how that was even possible. And so it was kind of difficult for someone who goes to public school, to have that exposure to something like that, to see someone so young going through that, but not have a complete understanding of why. And especially because I think you make better choices when you actually know what's going on, as opposed to not having the knowledge and getting yourself into a situation that you don't know how to control or to manage. But in general, I really do think that the topic of sex education is something that should probably be discussed when a child enters middle school, because especially if it's public school, I think it's a little different if you're going to like a private school or Montessori, because you don't have as much exposure to these themes. But elementary school is pretty tame compared to the kind of stuff that begins to pop up in middle school, because you suddenly have all these kids starting to begin the process of puberty and who are kind of, in a way, experimenting because they don't know any better. Because in middle school, you're automatically going to be surrounded by kids who haven't been taught properly or who don't have the same values, as in not having sex before you're married. So you have to kind of be able to navigate that without getting too shocked in a way, because it is a horrible thing that now people in my generation are so used to seeing these sexual themes at such an early age. But at the same time, if you don't teach them about it properly, then it's harder for them to handle seeing those things, and it's easier for them to get tricked into situations that they don't completely understand, or even just to have a hard time making friends with other kids, in the sense that you don't necessarily have to be good friends with some people who you don't agree with or what they're doing, or who are too really mature for you to be handling at that age. But you should at least be able to connect to them in the sense of seeing them as another human being and understanding that they have different values because they weren't taught in the same way you were. So I definitely think that the conversation should begin at the middle school age. For example, I have some cousins just now entering middle school, and they haven't really had much of a lesson on sex yet, but I'm pretty sure it's coming pretty soon, because this is their first time entering public school. They actually went to Montessori. So they're getting that new exposure that they haven't had before to these kids who are not raised like them. And so it's kind of, you have to figure out how to make your way in the world with these sexual themes without getting too overwhelmed in that sense. But as for who should be teaching the topic of sexual education, I definitely think it is the parents' responsibility, because that's kind of what you sign up for when you become a parent. Seems like, I mean, I don't know for sure yet, but that's your responsibility to teach your kids how they should behave and how sex relates to your own moral values and Christian values. But I do think, in a way, it is important for the schools to at least cover some of these things for the kids who don't have that same experience, because then you also have kids who are not being told how to at least have safe sex. I don't personally believe in sex before marriage, but a lot of these kids are not being taught that because their families don't have the same Christian values. So they at least need to be told what actually happens in the process, and how to at least have safe sex, because if they're going to do it, then I do think it's important to carry on the message that you shouldn't be having sex before you're married, but for some of these kids, it's just part of their life when they're raised in such a way that it's normal for them, but they don't always know all the full details of what goes on or how to do it safely. So I do think it is important for the school to have those lessons with kids, but I think it should be optional for the parents to be able to decide whether or not they want their kid to be a part of those lessons, especially because certain Christian denominations, like I'm Catholic, for example, don't believe in birth control or the use of birth control, because, again, we believe that if you wait to have sex until after you're married, then that's when, you can start having children, and we don't believe in restricting that. But the sexual education classes at a school teach that you should be using birth control and other things that for some kids, it's harder for them to make their own judgment about it. And it's harder for them to have a distinct opinion as opposed to just going along with what they're being told or what everyone else is telling them, because we're just so susceptible to any kind of influence at this age. So I do think it is important for schools to have those lessons for some kids, but that it definitely should be an option for the parent as to whether or not they want their child to attend that class.
Yeah, I think those are really good points that you bring. And I will agree with you that it is the responsibility, in this case, of the parents to guide the children in the different topics. In today's environment, there are many messages. You know, you have music, you have TV, you have video games, you have a lot of media and the internet. And there are many messages that the youth receive, and we all receive, regarding different subjects. And one of them, I believe, is the topic of, or the subject of sex. And I know you mentioned that you think it should, conversation should start around middle school. However, I was reading about like even conversations with little ones. And of course, like I think it depends on the age. Like the conversation is appropriate for certain ages, you know, like I think when between 0 to 2 years old, a child, well, between 0 and 1, you know, there is not much conversation there. But when the kid starts learning words, even like about body parts, you know, it shouldn't be shameful to talk about body parts, because it's natural, right? So from that perspective, and I know you mentioned like you were reading a book in 5th grade. But do you think like nowadays the information is even more available? Like your peers, you know, do you think they go ahead and rather Google, like, for example, let's talk about like, what does pornography means, versus going to mom and ask, and mom and dad and ask them, mom, like, what does pornography means? Or dad, what does pornography means? Like, which do you think is easier for someone around your age, or even someone that is in 5th grade? What do you think is more like an easier conversation, or easier to do, to Google it or to go to mom and dad? I'm like super cool. I think it's super cool that you went to mom and dad and asked them. Not many do that. But what do you see around your peers?
Yeah, I definitely think more internet. I think it's a little harder for me to kind of see that other perspective from a young age, just because I haven't, you know, don't have any kids yet.
Right.
And because like I have an older sister, I don't have any younger siblings, so I haven't had that same experience in that sense. But I completely understand what you're saying there, because it is true that you just have this natural curiosity to understand things you don't. And I definitely think a lot of kids do turn to the internet because, you know, to go to your parent and ask about things that I think from a young child's perspective, they might think could get them in trouble for asking, or, you know, it's kind of awkward or embarrassing just because they don't understand, and because maybe their classmates were like whispering about it in the way that made it seem like it was some sort of secret, you know? So I definitely think they do turn to the internet more. And because it's more, in a way, it's more technical and kind of concise, you know, because I can see a parent having some difficulties trying to explain sex, because it's just it can be a difficult topic to try to convey to someone younger than you. So I definitely think that they do turn to the internet, especially because it's so present and available now.
Yeah, for sure. I think like we can just go and Google whatever word comes to our mind, and then there you go. It's like super fast, super accessible. And so what do you think? I don't know in your case, but I know some parents like try to put a lot of safeguard and try maybe to prevent some information that way. But from my perspective, and of course I'm not in a school setting as a youth. I'm not a youth no more. I used to be one, but I would think like as a youth, you can always find ways to find information, right? Maybe the school has a lot of safeguards, but hey, like maybe my mom and dad don't let me use a phone, or at home, like the internet is blocked, but I can go and ask my friend and check it out through their phone, right?
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah,
go ahead. I think you had.
Yeah, I mean, just as someone who's had that experience, you know, I remember when I was little, my parents would have like the child restriction on my iPod before I had a phone. And as a child, I remember we could figure out ways to, we knew all the passwords for everything, so we could figure out how to unblock it, you know, and even on school computers where they restrict stuff, there's still ways to get past those restrictions. Like they even teach us to get on some websites that are blocked that they want us to get on for research about certain topics that are more mature, you know, like when we're reading a book in a literature class that has some different kind of topics that are a lot more mature. So yeah, they definitely find ways to get around these things because and we're so technology geared that we're more able to figure out how to find all these different ways to get around blocking things. And in a way, I almost think it's kind of a good thing to have that natural curiosity, because it kind of means once you get that out of your system, in a way, you're less likely to make certain decisions later on that might not be so good, because you actually, it's like touching an electric fence. You know, it hurts, so you realize not to do it again. So it's kind of the same thing as looking up things you don't necessarily think are appropriate, but doing it for curiosity's sake, and then realizing you maybe don't need to go any deeper with what you're looking at.
Yeah, I think I do appreciate the fact that you mentioned like it's normal to be curious. I think perhaps the hook is if you end up like so mesmerized by it that you no longer can go ahead and remove yourself from certain situations. That is why I think it's very important to start a conversation like early. Like in your case, you mentioned like you were reading a book. So who would have thought, you know, you were reading a book and then this topic came about, and then you asked your mom and dad. Was it awkward? Like were your mom and dad were like, oh my gosh, what am I going to say? Or was it like from your perspective, how is that the conversation went about?
Okay, so for me, I see things in a very logical standpoint, and I'm very just straightforward and direct. So for my parents, they were just they were pretty honest. You know, they didn't, I feel like they didn't have a hard time kind of discussing it with me without it being awkward, because also, I mean, at my age, that's when, you know, a lot of more social media stuff was becoming more prevalent when I was that age. And the internet and TV shows were kind of being more mature in a sense. Like, you know, when my parents were little, a lot of TV shows would kind of avoid these topics because it wasn't as appropriate. But now they kind of involve those topics a lot more in TV and in media. So when I was little, I had remembered my parents watching shows that had mature themes, you know, and they wouldn't allow me to watch it, but every once in a while I would see something or glimpse something. So I kind of had a baseline idea of what was going on, but I didn't really fully understand it. So for them, it wasn't quite as hard as a conversation, because I had already been exposed to some of these things, and because I was willing to just accept what they said was the truth, which I can understand, though, that for some kids that's a lot harder, because I could just accept that and say, okay, so that's what that is, and move on. But for some kids, it's definitely, you know, they continue to have questions about it and want to know more and more and more. And so I think that could be a lot harder for a parent having that kind of situation, and especially when you don't have, especially, well, I think when you're not, if your parent wasn't raised to be able to openly discuss these things, I think that makes the conversation a lot harder, because their own experience would be not talking about sex education and things like that. So it would be a lot harder for them to be open about their opinions about it. And again, from the perspective of someone who's Catholic, it is more of an open conversation, because they teach from an early age in churches, you know, that we don't approve of birth control. They talk about the Immaculate Conception. So for some kids from that background, at least, I feel like we have a kind of a better grasp on what's going on, and it's more available to us.
I do appreciate, because I think you made a point that I want to kind of pick, and it's the fact that a relationship, I think when we have a relationship with mom or dad, and in my case with our teens, then the conversation is easier. And from what you mentioned, I think it stood out, like your parents are honest, and you know they're going to tell you how things are. Therefore, you're going to trust in them. Like an example that comes to mind is some time ago, someone was saying, my mom says that if I kiss a boy, I'm going to get pregnant. And I was just thinking, like, if one, let's say someone ends up kissing her, and then of course we know that doesn't happen, then it's kind of a lie, right? And then many things that then maybe we as parents jokingly, or maybe because we're not trying to go too deep into those conversations, make up stuff, it can be like actually like damaging in the long term. Because if we are maybe lying, and some, it seems so like such a small lie, right? But then um, many other things may be lies as well. So I do appreciate what you mentioned about having this close relationship and be able to talk about the many different subjects, and like be open, and also know that your parents have the best interest in mind, because they are really invested in you, and of course they want what is best for you. So let's be sure, like we have some people around. Thank you for joining the conversation. If you have any questions for Kate or I, feel free to use the comment section or the question section. Let me see if there's any questions here. There's no questions right now. And today we're talking about sex and when is that we should start the conversation. Kate brought really, really good points as far as like, let's be sure like we are honest. Let's be sure that we are straightforward. And let's be sure that we build that relationship. So when we talk with our children, then there is no topic really that is awkward, right? I don't know how it is in your household, Kate. And also, I think you mentioned that in the environment where you are at, even at the church, they go ahead and actually talk about contraceptive. Is that a word?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
But then I also wonder, like, because nowadays, for example, I know based on research and information, like pornography is big. It's a big issue.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we may like shy away from that topic. The other thing that I think is a big issue is the many ideas that are out there regarding sexual identity. Are those things that, like for example, among your peers or even in the youth group, are those things like talked or mentioned, or people will stay away from those topics because they are like embarrassing or like awkward? Like what is your perspective?
I think it really just depends on the kid in a
Mm-hmm.
way, because it's like cliques in schools. You have a lot of different groups of different kids who kind of fit together, and so I think between those different groups is where the conversation can kind of vary. Like me and my friends, we wouldn't necessarily discuss those things, but it's not something we would shy away from either. We're just kind of, again, very direct and just kind of from a logical standpoint, as opposed to some other kids who are not really ashamed about anything and are just willing to talk about anything they feel like talking about, to anyone essentially. So I think because in a public school you're exposed to a lot of different kinds of people and a lot of different groups of people, that it isn't necessarily something that most people shy away from, in the sense of they're kind of open to talk about whatever they feel like talking about, and if it happens to be sex related, they're perfectly willing to just kind of continue the conversation. But for some people it of course isn't done in the most responsible way, definitely.
Right.
But then you definitely have the other groups of people who find it really embarrassing and are not quite mature enough to handle a conversation like that, or even to listen to someone talk about it irresponsibly and be able to just kind of walk away or ignore them, or just let them continue to do what they want to do without causing a complete argument over it. Because you do have some kids who will go up to them and say, this is an appropriate conversation for school, but that doesn't necessarily always help the situation. Because it kind of creates a really big conflict in that sense, because then you have these kids being seen as, I think prude would be the word. And then these other kids who just they haven't been taught when to discuss things. They haven't been taught to have that same experience of sometimes you don't say anything about it, or sometimes you walk away from this conversation. So I definitely think it can kind of be a struggle trying to get that balance of it being an open conversation, but also some kids not being able to handle it.
Right. I think that's a good point. Like, it's almost like know your audience and also like know who you're talking to, because to your point, I think we're all different, you know, and we all have different backgrounds. So public school, to your point, I think is indeed more open. The conversation is more open about many subjects, not only about sex. There are other subjects that like they talk about, including drugs or the use of substance or why not, versus if you are in like private school, and especially in like, let's say, a Christian school, then of course there is more safeguards, I think. And now let's move into a home school. Of course, the parents have more control over the conversations and the subjects and how you go about it. You mentioned earlier, and I want to bring that up, is like the conversation should start at home, which I, once again, 100% agree with you. I shared like the conversation should start like as young as when they start talking, because it's nothing to be ashamed of. God created us, and he created us perfectly, and he created us with purpose. So when we talk even about our body parts, there is no shame in that, because we were created like that. And so I think if we start a conversation early, it's very important. You also mentioned about having this relationship. And the part that I wanted to, that I remember and got stuck with me, is that the conversation starts at home with our parents, and that a school even should be respectful and even ask permission to the parents, because from my understanding is that in some places nowadays they don't even ask for the parental permission, which I think is not the correct approach. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so like health class is required
Yeah.
at my school and at many schools in the United States and even all over the world. And so they didn't ask my parents' permission when they had the sex education part of health, because it was something they did in every health class, you know, and it's just so procedural in a way. It kind of, I think definitely our society kind of takes away from what makes sex special, you know, just by generalizing it so much and just making it the conversation where, to a point, the straightforwardness can be a bad thing, at least like in a school situation, because you have kids just being exposed to this, and they're not necessarily being set down and talked to about abstaining from sex until marriage. So, you know, they're just being told how to have safe sex and to not, you know, if they want to do it, to go ahead and do it. So I think for some kids, they aren't going to get the conversation at home, so they do need that. But for other kids, it kind of it can kind of be completely against what their parents might want them to feel about sex. So I definitely think I think it's an issue. I think parents should be able to have more of a say and a role in whether or not they want their kid to be a part of that section of the health class.
Yeah, you know what? You brought a really interesting point. That is the fact that when the school goes ahead and talks, they talk about like do it and do it safe. But then they forget the other part of the conversation, which is an option too. You know, so I think in education, when we are going to share information, let's share all the information. Why is that we go ahead and target or push one and then forget about the other one? Well, let's go ahead and be honest. If we want to be honest, let's kind of provide the information and all the options that are available. And I think even us as parents, you know, we want to be sure that we share the information. Of course, as parents, it's our responsibility to guide. And you brought the word morals, and those are learned at home. Those are not learned at school, you know. So very, very interesting that you mentioned that, and I do appreciate your input. And well, we're at the top of the hour. Kate, it would be so nice to, I was telling you this before, it would be so nice to have a one conversation, like almost like you do a presentation and be done with it, with this topic. However, that is not the case. Um, in fact, it's part of our role to, as parents, to talk about uncomfortable topics before others share their bias and input from things such when it's appropriate to have sex. Is pornography okay? You know, things like, once again, sometimes we parents may shy away from the conversation. And this topic is vast and it's a lifelong conversation. So we're talking about that right now. You talk about that with your parents when you were in 5th grade. Later on, you are going to make decisions, so that is going to come back again. If one day you decide to have children, that conversation is going to come again, and you may be having a conversation later on with your mom or friends. So it's an ongoing conversation. It's a lifelong conversation. So yes, for whomever is watching this later on or right now, in 2 weeks, and Kate, that goes for you too, I'm going to have a special guest. Her name is Tina Griffith, and she's counterculture mom. And she's going to be sharing about the sexual agenda of today's environment. So keep an eye on that. It's going to be July 9th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Bring your questions. And thank you once again, Kate. I look forward to have another conversation with you in the future. And for our, do you have any closing remarks? I don't say that.
I was going to say that also with the health class, sometimes it disrespects people's religious opinions in a way, because they do talk about abortion with their sex education. And some parents, from their religious viewpoint, don't want their children being exposed to that kind of thing. So I definitely think there's just more to the conversation of whether or not these health classes should be mandatory, and whether or not a parent should have more say.
Yeah, that's a good, I think, closing remark. And as parents, let's remember that it is our responsibility to guide our children. And Kate, thank you once again for today's conversation. It was a pleasure having you. And it is my desire that for us who claim Christ, for us to be good representative of who he is in the way that we go and talk, and in the way that we go and live our lives. If you're just joining right now, be sure to check the IGTV, because it's going to go there. And thank you again, Kate. And it is my desire for you to have a good day. Bye.
Bye.